I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And
For generations, the royal family's survival has depended on one simple rule. No one uses palace power for their own private advantage. To the public, the royals seem totally united and focused on duty. But behind closed doors, real power comes down to who controls the institution's biggest secrets. When Prince William discovered that Camilla had built a private, unauthorized network of influence away from official palace oversight, he didn't start a public feud or wait for a royal committee to fix it. He took action immediately, stepping in to completely shut down her shadow operation and strip away her unapproved privileges before he even becomes king. The breach at Ray Mill House has always operated outside the standard machinery of the royal household. For decades, it was treated as Camilla's private sanctuary, a space entirely immune to the institutional oversight that governs every other royal residence. But when evidence of unauthorized institutional leverage was discovered within its walls, that immunity evaporated overnight. The response from Prince William was neither emotional nor public. It was a cold, deliberate exercise in institutional authority. In a single, silent move, the future king used what was uncovered to dismantle her influence and strip away privileges the palace will never speak of out loud. To understand why a stone house in Wiltshire suddenly became the focal point of a constitutional shift, you have to understand how power is held inside the modern monarchy. Official power is recorded. It is filed in state archives, managed by private secretaries, and monitored by government liaison officers. But unofficial power, the kind that controls access, shapes appointments, and subtly directs institutional strategy, operates in the dark spaces between official duties. Ray Mill was purchased in the 1990s following her divorce, long before the reality of her current title was guaranteed. It remained her private property. While Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Highgrove are subject to strict security protocols, administrative auditing, and institutional oversight, Ray Mill was always treated as off-limits. It was the one location where couriers arrived without entering logbooks, where private correspondence was stored without passing through the central registry, and where personal advisors met away from the gaze of the palace senior staff. For years, this arrangement was tolerated. It was viewed as a necessary concession to maintain personal equilibrium within the household. But tolerance in the royal world is conditional. It depends entirely on the assumption that private spaces are used exclusively for private life. That assumption collapsed when William's internal security team identified a consistent pattern of information moving away from standard palace networks. It was not a breach caused by external hostile actors or media intrusion. It was a deliberate, structured transfer of documentation from official channels into a private setting. The security apparatus that serves the Prince of Wales is not merely interested in physical protection. Its primary duty is to safeguard the long-term integrity of the crown and the future reign. When information concerning official appointments, future royal trust arrangements, and sensitive internal reviews began appearing in discussions where they did not belong, the source was systematically traced. The trail did not end at Clarence House or Buckingham Palace. It led directly to Ray Mill. The discovery was not made during a dramatic raid or an unexpected confrontation. That is not how the palace operates. It was executed through a quiet, systematic audit of physical courier routes and digital access logs that had been quietly implemented months prior. The intelligence gathered showed that Ray Mill had ceased to be merely a private retreat for family gatherings. It had been converted into a shadow repository, holding sensitive internal documents, unredacted records of private discussions between senior figures, and informal agreements regarding post-reign governance. The moment those documents crossed the boundary from official royal archives into an unmonitored private property, the legal and institutional landscape changed instantly. It was no longer a question of family dynamics or personal boundaries. It became an issue of institutional security. William was informed of the situation privately. There were no urgent meetings summoned with senior communications directors. There were no leaks to favored royal correspondence. The immediate response was characterized by absolute operational silence. In the royal world, silence is often the most dangerous signal. When the palace intends to manage a public relations issue, it generates noise. It releases statements, coordinates background briefings, and arranges public appearances to control the narrative. When it intends to exercise real power, it becomes completely quiet. William recognized the implications immediately. The existence of an unmonitored archive at Ray Mill represented an unacceptable vulnerability. More importantly, it demonstrated that an alternative node of authority had been operating outside the control of the reigning sovereign and the heir to the throne. For a future king whose entire strategy relies on a streamlined, central, and strictly controlled monarchy, the existence of a shadow operation was intolerable. It was a direct challenge to the authority of his coming reign. The information held within those walls was not just private correspondence, it was leverage. It was designed to ensure that specific networks of influence, appointed advisors, and private funding arrangements would remain protected even after the current reign came to an end. The decision to act was taken without consulting external advisors or cabinet committees. William understood that involving standard palace machinery would inevitably lead to delay, compromise, and potential information leaks. Instead, he treated the issue as an immediate institutional breach that required a direct, irreversible solution. The authority to deal with an internal breach of this magnitude rests with those who hold the future of the institution. William did not raise the issue as a son addressing a stepmother. He approached it strictly as the Prince of Wales addressing a member of the royal household who had overstepped the firm boundaries of her role. The evidence compiled by his team was thorough, verified, and impossible to refute. It detailed every document transferred, every unrecorded meeting held at the property, and every attempt to establish an independent network of authority outside the knowledge of the central household. The message delivered to Ray Mill was not an invitation to negotiate. It was a notification of reality. The immunity that the private residence had enjoyed for nearly 3 decades was revoked in an instant. The informal authority that had been built up quietly over years was systematically identified, isolated, and prepared for removal. The breach at Ray Mill was not the end of the process. It was merely the catalyst. It provided the concrete, undeniable evidence required to execute a shift in power that had been building beneath the surface for years. The quiet retreat in Wiltshire, once considered the safest sanctuary in the royal ecosystem, had become the precise location where the future king established his total authority over the interior of the monarchy. What was found? To understand the severity of the crisis that unfolded inside the royal household, one must first dismantle the assumption that this was a matter of personal scandal or minor family friction. It was neither. The materials uncovered at Ray Mill House did not concern private lives, tabloid gossip, or personal indiscretions. What sat within the secure repositories of that Wiltshire retreat was something far more consequential to the continuity of the British state. It was a structured, deliberate accumulation of institutional intelligence. When Prince William's team verified the contents of the files held at the private property, the scale of the operation became undeniable. These were not casual mementos or discarded working papers left behind after official duties. They were systematic records. Among the materials were unredacted minutes of highly sensitive meetings between senior royals and foreign representatives, private financial arrangements detailing undisclosed offshore trust networks connected to extended household members, and extensive internal dossiers on senior members of the royal staff. Most critical, however, was the presence of draft constitutional agreements and administrative frameworks designed specifically for the period following the current reign. These documents outlined a coordinated strategy to lock in specific appointments, secure lifetime funding allocations for designated private offices, and maintain independent advisory access to government ministers well past the eventual transition of power. It was, in the most literal sense, a blueprint for a shadow court. For centuries, the British monarchy has survived on a singular, non-negotiable rule. There can only be one center of gravity. Power flows exclusively from the reigning sovereign, with the active alignment of the heir to the throne. The moment a competing node of influence attempts to construct its own permanent apparatus, the stability of the entire institution is placed in jeopardy. The documents at Ray Mill demonstrated a clear intention to create a self-sustaining structure that would operate independently of William's future authority. By holding confidential records, private correspondence between monarchs, and proprietary institutional data away from the official archives at Windsor Castle, Camilla's network had established a significant reserve of leverage. leverage that could be used to influence future policy, protect favored staff, and ensure that certain royal assets remained firmly within specific hands long after the current sovereign's passing. The intelligence gathered did not just reveal what had been accumulated, it exposed how long the process had been underway. The records dated back nearly 2 decades, tracing a quiet, methodical gathering of administrative material that accelerated dramatically in recent years. It became clear that, as the health and focus of the senior generation shifted, the private sanctuary in Wiltshire had quietly transformed into the administrative heart of an unauthorized power network. When William examined the compiled dossier presented by his security detail, the conclusion was stark. This was not a passive collection of historical files. It was an active mechanism of institutional control. The existence of these documents outside official palace oversight represented a profound breach of constitutional protocol. Standard procedure dictates that all records involving state matters, official patronages, and royal finance must be logged, processed, and preserved within the royal archives under strict institutional supervision. By redirecting sensitive records to a private estate immune to official audit, the individuals involved had created a dangerous precedent. If these documents were ever subjected to unauthorized access, legal dispute, or public exposure, the damage to the Crown's institutional integrity would be irreparable. The realization inside William's private office was immediate. The issue could not be managed through traditional diplomatic conversations within the family. It could not be smoothed over with informal assurances or polite compromises. To allow an unmonitored archive of this nature to exist was to invite ongoing instability into his future reign. The nature of the materials also revealed a deep miscalculation by those who had assembled them. The architects of this private network had assumed that Ray Mill's status as a personal, privately owned property would provide permanent protection against internal investigation. They believed the standard conventions of royal privacy would prevent the heir to the throne from looking too closely into what occurred behind those closed doors. They had severely underestimated Prince William. William does not view the monarchy through the lens of personal sentiment or historical precedent alone. He views it as an institutional structure that must be protected with absolute rigor. To him, the preservation of the Crown's future authority supersedes any internal political considerations or personal relationships. The moment evidence of structural overreach was verified, the retreat's private status became entirely irrelevant. The contents of the files provided William with something far more decisive than mere grounds for concern. They provided him with absolute, undeniable leverage. The documentation proved beyond question that private boundaries had been crossed and that institutional authority had been bypassed for the creation of an independent power base. There were no debates held within the walls of Kensington Palace about how to proceed. The evidence spoke for itself. The existence of these files transformed what might have been a subtle internal rivalry into an explicit institutional conflict. A conflict where the rules of engagement were defined entirely by the future king. The discovery at Ray Mill stripped away the illusion that the internal power balance of the royal household could remain static. It proved that while the public was presented with a narrative of unity and smooth transition, a silent battle for long-term control was being conducted behind the scenes. William now held the full picture. He knew every name involved, every document secured, and every strategy drafted to undermine the clean authority of his coming reign. The materials found in that quiet Wiltshire house were not just papers. They were the key to dismantling an entire network of unauthorized influence. Armed with this evidence, William was prepared to execute a strike so precise, so quiet, and so comprehensive that those responsible would have no means of retaliation, no room for public narrative management, and no choice but to submit to the absolute authority of the Crown. William's calculated strike. When the decision was made to act, Prince William did not convene the traditional apparatus of the royal household. There were no urgent conferences with the Lord Chamberlain, no formal summits at Buckingham Palace, and no consultation with external public relations advisors. To involve the standard institutional channels would invite delay, leakage, and the inevitable dilution of authority that comes when committees attempt to manage internal conflict. Instead, the future king bypassed the administrative machinery entirely. He treated the situation not as a personal disagreement to be negotiated, but as an immediate institutional breach that required a direct and absolute response. The execution was designed with cold mathematical precision. William understood that when dealing with an unauthorized power network, speed and absolute containment are paramount. If the target of an action is given time to consult advisors, brief sympathetic media contacts, or appeal to the sovereign on emotional grounds, the initiative is lost. The strike had to be delivered as a total, irreversible fait accompli before any defensive strategy could be mounted. The encounter did not take place in an official stateroom or amidst the grandeur of a formal residence. It occurred in absolute privacy, far removed from the sight of household staff and personal attendants. William presented the evidence directly. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, and no emotional appeals. The style of delivery was deliberately detached, mirroring the tone of a high-level state briefings rather than a family confrontation. On the table sat the compiled dossier, precise inventories of the documents held at Ray Mill House, complete timelines of unauthorized material transfers, and logged records of unrecorded meetings held outside official channels. Every piece of intelligence was verified, cross-referenced, and laid out with absolute clarity. The message implicit in the presentation was immediate and devastating. The shadow network had been fully mapped. Every line of communication was exposed, and every strategy drafted to secure post-Rain leverage was now completely compromised. William did not offer an open dialogue. He presented a set of non-negotiable institutional mandates. The first directive was the immediate and total surrender of every physical and digital asset held at the Wiltshire property that originated from official state or royal archives. A specialized discreet security team under William's direct authority was dispatched to oversee the recovery and transfer of all materials back to the royal archives at Windsor Castle. No private copies were to be retained. No documents were to remain in unmonitored hands. The sanctuary of Ray Mill as an independent administrative hub was permanently terminated. The second directive targeted the operational mechanics of Camilla's authority. The informal privileges that had been quietly accumulated over years were systematically dismantled. Her independent advisory access to private secretaries, her authority to influence senior household appointments, and her capacity to request internal operational reviews were revoked with immediate effect. Moving forward, every official request, every staff directive, and every logistical arrangement concerning her office would pass directly through the central control of the Prince of Wales's administrative team. The third and most consequential measure was the complete severing of her private network from institutional funding and security arrangements. The designated advisors who had facilitated the shadow operation were quietly informed that their contracts with the royal household would not be renewed, and their access passes to official residences were rendered void overnight. They were not publicly dismissed. They were simply erased from the daily operations of the palace, isolated from the center of power, with a quiet finality that left them no legal or institutional recourse. The speed with which these directives were executed left Camilla's camp completely paralyzed. In traditional royal power struggles, the standard defense involves creating a counter-narrative, generating subtle leaks to friendly correspondence, or leveraging personal relationships to slow down administrative changes. But William had eliminated every standard line of defense. By maintaining absolute operational secrecy until the exact moment of delivery, he left no time for strategic intervention. Furthermore, the nature of the evidence rendered any attempt at public spin impossible. To challenge William's directives publicly or privately would mean risking the full exposure of what had been accumulated at Ray Mill House. The disclosure of an unauthorized private archive containing sensitive state and household records would cause unimaginable damage to her public standing and her historical legacy. The leverage that had been built to protect her future position had, in a single moment, been transformed into the precise tool used to neutralize her power. William made the stakes exceptionally clear. The containment of the scandal depended entirely on total compliance. Any attempt to bypass his directives, any subtle movement to re-establish independent lines of communication, or any effort to engage external allies would result in the immediate and formal revocation of all non-statutory royal privileges. This was not a temporary disciplinary measure. It was a permanent structural realignment. William was establishing the boundaries of his coming reign well in advance of his accession. He demonstrated to the entire royal ecosystem that while the king might wear the crown, the future of the institution was already being directed with iron control by the Prince of Wales. The strike was absolute. Within 48 hours of the evidence being presented, the shadow apparatus that had taken 2 decades to construct was completely dismantled. The physical records were secured in the vaults of Windsor Castle, the key personnel were removed from the household, and the private sanctuary in Wiltshire was returned to what it was originally meant to be, a simple private property with zero institutional authority. William walked away from the encounter, having achieved total operational victory, without a single public statement being issued, without a single headline appearing in the press, and without a single official meeting being logged in the court circular. It was a masterclass in the cold, silent exercise of institutional power. The removal of Camilla's network. The true measure of a power shift within the monarchy is never found in official bulletins or public statements. It is measured in the silent, immediate recalibration of human behavior inside the corridors of state. In the days that followed William's decisive action, a specific kind of stillness descended upon St. James's Palace, Clarence House, and Buckingham Palace. It was the distinct, cold quiet that occurs when an entire political ecosystem realizes, simultaneously and without a word being spoken, that an axis of power has permanently broken. For nearly 2 decades, Camilla's network had operated as one of the most effective, albeit covert, influence engines in British public life. It was a sophisticated web constructed with infinite patience. It comprised senior household administrators, former political strategists, sympathetic media figures, and high-level liaisons within key charitable foundations. These individuals did not draw their real authority from formal job descriptions. They drew it from their proximity to the Queen Consort and their implied ability to shape decisions at the highest levels of the monarchy. Overnight, that authority was removed. The mechanism of this collapse was not a series of dramatic dismissals or public scandals. That would have caused unnecessary institutional noise. Instead, it was an exercise in systematic, silent isolation. When William's directives took effect, the security credentials of key advisors were quietly deactivated. Access codes to internal operational databases were updated without notice. Meetings that had been routinely scheduled on palace calendars were removed without explanation. Private secretaries who had previously reported directly to Camilla's private office suddenly found their emails routed through Kensington Palace for clearance. Phone calls from long-standing allies were met with polite, standardized responses from junior staff who had been instructed to refer all administrative inquiries to the central household control. The shock among those who made up this shadow network was profound. They had operated under the absolute conviction that their position was secure, anchored by the king's devotion to his wife and the formidable institutional title she held. They had assumed that Raymil House was an impregnable fortress of private privilege. When they realized that the entire operation had been mapped, dismantled, and secured in the royal archives at Windsor without a single word leaking to the outside world, the instinct for self-preservation took over instantly. In the royal world, loyalty is rarely absolute. It is calibrated against the trajectory of power. The moment senior courtiers and institutional figures recognized that the Prince of Wales had asserted total authority over the interior of the monarchy, the alignment shifted completely. People who had spent years cultivating relationships with Camilla's inner circle suddenly became unreachable. Requests for informal meetings were quietly declined. Draft policy papers that had been circulating through her private office were abandoned. The network did not attempt to fight back or launch a counteroffensive. It could not. Without the protection of official status and stripped of the confidential materials that had served as their ultimate leverage, the key players were entirely helpless. They simply faded into the background, isolated from the center of power, and rendered completely irremediable. For Camilla, the reality of this new landscape was stark and unavoidable. She found herself in a position that the palace has historically reserved for those who have overreached their bounds, essential at the edges, entirely removed from the center. The formal titles remained untouched. The ceremonial public duties continued as scheduled. To the external world, the television cameras and the crowds gathered outside royal engagements, Nothing appeared to have changed. She still stood beside the sovereign at state occasions, attended official luncheons, and undertook patronages. But inside the walls, the reality was entirely transformed. She was now a queen consort surrounded by absolute administrative control. Her private office was no longer an independent node of power. It was a subdivision operating under the direct oversight of the future king's administrative team. Every letter drafted, every invitation issued, every travel itinerary arranged, and every speech prepared was subjected to strict institutional scrutiny. The capability to quietly direct the patronage funds, influence household promotions, or maintain off-the-record channels with external figures was permanently gone. The isolation was not just political, it was physical and operational. Staff members who had been loyal to her private interests were replaced by career administrators whose total loyalty lay with the continuity of the crown under William and Catherine. The private discussions that had once taken place behind closed doors at Clarence House were now impossible, as the key individuals who had facilitated those exchanges were no longer permitted access to the building. The evaporation of this network demonstrated a fundamental truth about the mechanics of the British monarchy. Titles, ceremonial honors, and public prominence are merely the superficial display of royal life. Real power consists of the ability to control information, direct resources, and influence the future direction of the institution. The moment that underlying trust was withdrawn by the heir to the throne, the impressive structure that had taken 20 years to build collapsed like a house of cards. The atmosphere within the household in the weeks following the strike was marked by a hyper-awareness of the new dynamic. Courtiers walked with absolute care, acutely aware that the era of competing centers of power was over. The message had been delivered to every department, every security detail, and every administrative office with unmistakable clarity. William had not merely stripped a stepmother of her unofficial privileges, he had sent an uncompromising signal to the entire institutional establishment. The future had arrived early, the shadow court had been liquidated, and those who wished to have a place in the coming reign understood precisely whose authority now governed the interior of the monarchy, the king's impossible position. For King Charles, the discovery of the breach at Ray Mill and the swift, silent intervention that followed created an unprecedented personal and political dilemma. The sovereign found himself caught in the middle of a high-stakes conflict that pitted his devotion as a husband against his fundamental duty to the crown. It was a situation that exposed the central, tragic reality of royal life. When personal relationships collide with the institutional survival of the monarchy, the institution must always prevail. Charles is a man deeply attuned to history, protocol, and the delicate balances of royal authority. He understood better than anyone the strategic brilliance and cold necessity of William's actions. Yet he was also the man who had spent decades fighting a long, exhausting war against public opinion and internal palace opposition to secure Camilla's place beside him. To see the network she had built systematically dismantled in a matter of hours and her influence reduced to mere ceremonial display was a profound personal blow. Yet the king was entirely powerless to intervene. To understand why the sovereign could not overrule his son, one must look at the constitutional and structural reality of the modern monarchy. Charles's reign, by its very nature, represents a bridge between the long era of Queen Elizabeth II and the future under King William V. The stability of his sovereign authority depends entirely on a seamless alignment with his heir. If the king were to openly oppose Prince William to protect an unauthorized shadow network, he would create an open, irreconcilable rift at the absolute apex of the state. Such a public or internal split would fatally undermine the authority of his own reign. It would signal to the government, the Commonwealth, and the public that the crown was divided against itself. William understood this dynamic perfectly when he executed his strike. He had intentionally framed the entire issue not as a domestic quarrel, but as a matter of institutional security and the protection of state records. By grounding his actions in the absolute defense of the crown's future, William left his father no legal, logical, or constitutional room to maneuver. For Charles to demand the return of the compromised documents to Ray Mill, or to insist on restoring Camilla's unofficial administrative channels, would be to endorse a direct breach of archival protocol and institutional integrity. The sovereign could not be seen defending the existence of an unmonitored shadow repository without compromising his own oath to protect the state. The private conversations between the king and the Prince of Wales during this period were characterized by a quiet, heavy restraint. There were no public disagreements, no dramatic press leaks, and no administrative counter orders issued from the king's private office. Charles recognized the ruthless logic that governed his son's actions. It was the exact same uncompromising institutional logic that had preserved the House of Windsor through centuries of political upheaval, world wars, and internal dynastic crises. History was rhyming inside the walls of the palace once again. Charles had spent his entire life watching the institution demand personal sacrifices from its members for the sake of long-term continuity. Now, as king, he was forced to watch the same relentless machinery operate within his own private household. The emotional burden on the king was immense. He was acutely aware of the deep isolation his wife was experiencing as her network was dissolved around her. He saw her key advisors removed, her private channels of influence severed, and her private office brought under the direct administrative oversight of Kensington Palace. Yet every time he looked at the dossier of evidence compiled by William's security detail, the reality was inescapable. The boundary between private sanctuary and institutional overreach had been crossed, and the consequences were absolute. Charles chose silent acquiescence. He allowed William's directives to stand in their entirety. He did not challenge the removal of the files to Windsor Castle. He did not block the deactivation of security passes for Camilla's former strategists. And he did not attempt to restore her access to internal operational reviews. This passive concurrence was the ultimate demonstration of William's complete victory. By compelling the sovereign to accept the total restructuring of the household without raising an official objection, the Prince of Wales proved that the real center of institutional gravity had already shifted. The king's decision to stand aside was not an act of weakness. It was a final, painful recognition of the monarchy's paramount law. The king is the custodian of the present, but the Prince of Wales is the custodian of the future. When the interests of the present reign conflict with the security of the coming one, the future must be given priority. Inside the quiet rooms of Clarence House, the dynamic permanently changed. The king and queen consort continued to perform their joint state functions with absolute professionalism, maintaining an unbroken public front for the nation. But beneath the surface of official duty sat the silent realization that the internal battle had been lost. Charles had been forced to make the ultimate choice between his personal sentiments and his sovereign duty. By choosing the crown, he ensured the stability of the monarchy, but at the cost of watching the future king permanently redefine the terms of power within his own home. What this evidence changes forever. When history assesses the realignment of power within the British monarchy, the quiet liquidation of the shadow network will not be remembered as a personal vendetta or a family dispute. It will be recorded as a masterclass in structural preservation. Prince William's intervention was never about punishment. It was about authority, continuity, and the deliberate construction of the state apparatus he and Catherine will inherit. In stripping away the unofficial privileges that had accumulated in Wiltshire, the future king did not simply resolve a contemporary crisis. He mapped the definitive boundaries of the modern crown. The consequences of this move are permanent. The physical records, once held in the vulnerability of a private estate, now sit behind the security vaults of Windsor Castle, integrated into the official archives where they belong. The personnel who facilitated the shadow court have been quietly absorbed back into private life, completely neutralized and permanently removed from the levers of palace administration. The private sanctuary at Mill House has been stripped of its institutional relevance, returned entirely to the private sphere, stripped of its leverage, and disconnected from the machinery of state. The message sent across the entire royal ecosystem was unmistakable. The era of competing interests, off-the-record influence networks, and parallel courts is officially over. The future monarchy will not tolerate shadow centers of gravity. It will be streamlined, disciplined, and governed from a single, unambiguous center of control. For William and Catherine, this decisive action marks the complete consolidation of their internal standing. They have demonstrated that they do not need to wait for the crown to exercise genuine institutional power. By moving swiftly to protect the interior of the monarchy long before the eventual transition of power, they have proven to the household, the establishment, and the government that the leadership of the coming reign is already in absolute command. Power inside the Windsor world is not inherited automatically when the time comes. It is secured by those willing to protect the institution's interior before the crown even changes hands. William saw a threat to the clean authority of his future reign, moved with absolute precision, and left no room for the decision to be revisited. The Shadow Court has been liquidated, the interior has been secured, the crown has chosen its future, and the shift in power is complete. The British monarchy does not survive by accident. It survives because in every generation, those who carry its future are prepared to do whatever it takes to preserve its core. The quiet purge of Raymill House was a clear statement that the coming reign will be governed by iron discipline and absolute institutional clarity. William and Catherine are no longer just preparing for the future, they are actively shaping it from within. Did William go too far, or was the villa evidence exactly the kind of line that demanded exactly this response? The monarchy will never look quite the same after this.